They thought they could erase him for being gay, for being broken. But what happened that night turned shame into power. The warm amber glow of Bella Vista, an upscale Italian restaurant in downtown San Diego, reflected against polished wine glasses and white linen. It was the kind of place where couples celebrated anniversaries and executives closed deals, not a place where a man like Ethan Hayes felt he belonged anymore. At 32, he carried a body forever changed by war. The IED blast in Afghanistan had stolen both his legs and left invisible wounds that still woke him in the dark. For 2 years, he had avoided nights out, convinced the world only saw him as damaged. But tonight he was determined. He guided his wheelchair carefully across the marble floor, the steady rhythm of Rex's paws beside him. Rex, a golden retriever with a calm gaze and an official service vest, had been trained to sense the rising tide of Ethan's panic before it drowned him. The dog's presence was not just comfort, it was Ethan's lifeline against the sudden flashbacks that could tighten his chest without warning. Pinned to the lapel of Ethan's dark jacket was something even smaller than the service tag, but heavier in meaning, a rainbow pin, barely larger than a coin. It was the only piece of himself he refused to hide. Once, his parents had told him he could either renounce it or lose them forever. He chose truth, and they turned their backs. Tonight, he wore it anyway. The restaurant hushed for a moment as Ethan rolled inside. A few glances flickered toward the wheelchair, then the shimmer of the rainbow pin under the chandelier light. Most returned to their wine and conversations. But Vincent Caruso, the manager in a tailored suit with a permanent frown etched into his features, froze. His eyes narrowed the way a man looks not at a customer, but at a problem. He stepped forward, blocking Ethan's path with a polite smile sharpened into disdain. His voice carried, sharp enough to pierce the soft music. "We don't serve veterans with ease," he said, gesturing toward Rex. Then his gaze dropped to the rainbow pin. "And frankly, people like you don't belong here either." The words cut through the dining room like shattered glass. Forks paused in midair. Wine nearly spilled. The string quartet in the corner faltered, one violin note screeching before silence swallowed it. What had been an evening of elegance turned suddenly into an arena of judgment. Ethan froze. The law was on his side. He knew the Americans with Disabilities Act protected his right to enter with Rex. But Caruso hadn't only denied that right, he had twisted the knife, making Ethan's very identity the target. Disabled, gay, unwelcome. Every scar Ethan carried seemed to burn under the chandelier's light. He wanted to vanish, to roll backward out the door before the humiliation deepened. His chest tightened, memories flooding back, his mother's voice telling him never to come home again, his father's silence as the door closed, and now this stranger's voice, declaring to an entire room that he was unworthy. Around him, reactions split the air. One couple whispered and shook their heads with sympathy. Another man smirked as if he agreed with the manager. Most people looked away, clinking glasses to escape the discomfort. In that silence, Ethan felt as though the walls pressed closer, crushing him beneath the weight of every rejection he had ever endured. He lowered his eyes to Rex, whose steady golden presence remained unshaken, and tried to steady his breath. He had only wanted a meal, a brief taste of normal life. Instead, the evening had turned into a trial. Yet what Ethan could not know in that moment was that the trial would not be his alone to bear. Across the room, unseen behind the wall of stairs, 4 figures were already watching. Their silence would not last, because sometimes when the world tries to erase someone, it only takes a few to make the room remember what dignity looks like. If stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe to Heart Story, where voices once silenced find the strength to be heard. And in that night's humiliation lies the first truth. Silence allows cruelty to grow, but standing present in one's truth, even while shaking, is the seat of power. Ethan gripped the wheels of his chair, steadying himself as the sting of Vincent Caruso's words echoed in his chest. For a moment he thought of leaving, of sparing himself the humiliation, but something inside him held. He cleared his throat, his voice quiet yet edged with the discipline of a soldier. He explained that Rex was not a pet, not a disturbance, but a service dog recognized by federal law. The Americans with Disabilities Act gave him the right to be here, to eat like any other customer. He had rehearsed those words before, knowing that confrontation was always a possibility. But Caruso's face twisted into a sneer. His voice grew louder, meant not just for Ethan, but for every table within earshot. "This is fine dining, not a shelter." He spat. "We don't want customers disturbed by a crippled scene or a gay parade pin." The words landed heavier than any physical blow. Ethan's body remembered pain, the searing blast in Afghanistan that tore through his legs. The months of recovery when doctors doubted if he would ever sit upright again. But this was different. This was the old wound he could never close. The wound of being told that the cost of living his truth was rejection. He had heard those words before, in another form. The day he came out to his parents, there had been no gunfire, no explosion, only silence that stretched like an endless battlefield. His mother's face had hardened. His father's hand rested on the doorknob, and within minutes the ties of blood had been severed. From that moment, the home he once fought to return to became a place he would never step inside again. Now, under the chandeliers of Bella Vista, he felt that same blade cutting deep. Not only the wheelchair marked him, not only the scars that peeked from beneath his sleeves, but the rainbow pin that dared to shine against his chest. He was being targeted from every angle: disabled, gay, unwelcome. His heart thudded so loudly he could hear it above the quiet gasps and murmurs of the room. The atmosphere turned heavier, divided. A woman at one table lowered her gaze with pity, her hands tightening around her glass as though she wished she could disappear from the scene. A man in a pressed suit smirked with quiet approval at Caruso's cruelty. Most remained silent, their complicity carved into their refusal to act. To Ethan, the silence was worse than the insult. It was the sound of a society still willing to look away when dignity was stripped from someone in plain sight. He bent forward slightly, his head heavy, and for an instant the thought of retreat whispered in his ear. If he left now, he could avoid the humiliation of further spectacle. He could protect what little was left of his pride. His hands trembled as they pressed against the rims of his chair, and his vision blurred with shame. But Rex, steady and loyal, nudged his leg brace with a gentle nose. The golden retriever's calm eyes seemed to remind him that he was not alone, not entirely. Still, when Ethan felt the urge to escape rising stronger than his will to stay. And then, without warning, the scrape of chairs echoed from the far corner of the restaurant. The sound broke through the tension like a sudden command in combat. Ethan lifted his eyes and saw 4 men rising in unison. Their postures were unmistakable, their presence commanding, shoulders squared, movements crisp, the bearing of men forged in discipline. They were Navy SEALs from the Coronado base nearby Rodriguez. Thompson, Martinez, and Chin. They had been watching quietly, but the moment Caruso's last insult echoed through the room, they stood as one. The shift in energy was immediate. Conversations halted. Silverware clinked against plates in surprise, and every head turned to witness what would unfold. Ethan's breath caught. He had never met them before. Yet something in their stance carried the weight of brotherhood, the kind of unspoken solidarity that transcends personal ties. They were not simply bystanders, they were soldiers recognizing a fallen comrade under attack, and their silence had reached its breaking point. In that instant, Ethan realized that humiliation did not always end in defeat. Sometimes it marked the threshold of something greater, the moment when others could no longer remain still. What Caruso had intended as degradation became the spark that forced a choice: stand in cruelty, or stand against it. And in that dining room, the choice was about to be made clear. Because injustice thrives when silence reigns. But the courage of a few can turn a tide no one expects. And Ethan, who almost rolled away in shame, now found himself at the center of a gathering storm that would define the night. The restaurant fell into a stillness so sharp that even the flicker of candle flames seemed to pause. Ethan Hayes turned his head, his pulse still erratic from the humiliation, and saw the 4 men approaching. Rodriguez, Thompson, Martinez, and Chin walked with the quiet authority of Navy SEALs who had stood on more dangerous ground than this polished dining room. Their boots struck the floor with measured confidence, each step echoing louder than the music that had long since stopped. They halted in front of Vincent Caruso. The manager's smugness faltered at the sight of them. Rodriguez, the eldest among them, spoke first. His voice was low, yet it carried enough force to reach every corner of the room. "This man is a disabled veteran," he said, his hand gesturing toward Ethan. "And you're not just breaking the law, you're shaming someone who gave everything for this country." The words hit like a charge, detonating in silence. Caruso stiffened, trying to recover his composure. "He's making people uncomfortable," he muttered, his tone brittle, but his eyes darted nervously across the crowd now leaning closer to witness. Thompson's jaw tightened. His voice, sharp and unwavering, cut through the air. "What? Because he's gay, because he's in a wheelchair. He's more of a man than you'll ever be." For Ethan, the words landed with a force greater than he expected. He had long carried the weight of invisibility, the sense that no one dared to name what he endured. To hear it spoken aloud, not in pity, but in defense, was like air rushing into lungs starved too long. The sting of shame began to shift into something heavier but steadier: validation. Martinez stepped closer, his eyes locked on Caruso. "We've fought beside men and women of every kind," he said firmly. "On the field, no one asked who you loved. No one cared about a pin on your jacket. They cared if you had the courage to stand when it mattered. And he," Martinez pointed toward Ethan, "stood, and he paid a price you will never understand." The room was silent, but it was no longer passive silence. It was the silence of people wrestling with the truth being laid bare. A young couple glanced at each other, their earlier hesitation now replaced by something closer to admiration. A waiter shifted uncomfortably, the tray in his hands trembling slightly, torn between his manager's authority and the clear injustice unfolding. Chin, who had stood quiet until now, finally spoke. His words were not loud, yet they carried a weight that seemed to still even Caruso's protests. "You've mistaken dignity for disturbance. You've mistaken the service for shame, but you don't get to decide whose humanity is worth less." Ethan felt his throat tighten, not with fear, but with something unfamiliar being seen without disguise. For years, his identity had been the fracture line through which rejection seeped, first from his parents, then from strangers who recoiled at the sight of his chair, now from a manager who wielded prejudice with impunity. But in that moment, those fractures became something else, places where solidarity could take root. Caruso's lips parted, but no defense formed. The authority of the SEALs filled the space he once controlled. The power dynamics had shifted, and everyone knew it. Ethan, sitting low in his chair, no longer seemed like the most vulnerable figure in the room. Instead, Caruso's hauteur crumbled under the weight of four men who had no need to raise their voices further. What stirred in Ethan's chest was not triumph, but a kind of awakening. He realized that prejudice thrives in shadows, in the quiet agreement of those who say nothing. But the moment someone names it, exposes it, and stands against it, the illusion of power begins to collapse. Injustice often disguises itself as order, as rules, as so-called standards meant to protect comfort. But comfort bought by silencing another's existence is nothing but cruelty wrapped in etiquette. What the SEALs had done was simple. They had disrupted that disguise. And as Ethan looked at them, standing tall where he could not, he understood a truth he had almost forgotten, that courage is not only found on battlefields overseas, it is found in ordinary rooms, in unexpected moments, when someone decides silence is no longer an option. Vincent Caruso's face flushed red as if the velvet walls themselves were closing in on him. Surrounded by stares, he tried to claw back control with the only weapon he had left: threats. His voice cracked as he barked, "I'll call the police. We'll see what they have to say about this disruption." Rodriguez didn't flinch. He crossed his arms, his eyes steady. "Do it," he said flatly. Let's have the cops explain federal law and civil rights inside your own dining room. The challenge cut through the tension like steel. A murmur rolled across the tables, uncertain at first, then louder. Like a tide shifting against the shore, guests leaned forward, no longer able to sip wine and pretend neutrality. A few pulled out phones, recording every word, capturing the moment when arrogance collided with resistance. By the time two uniformed officers entered, the restaurant was no longer a single crowd. It was two camps staring at one another across polished floors and white linen. On one side, those clinging to comfort, whispering that rules were rules and perhaps the manager had a point. On the other, those whose faces carried recognition of sons, brothers, or neighbors once silenced, of a struggle that sounded too familiar to ignore. A woman in her 60s rose from her seat, her hands trembling as she pressed a tissue to her cheek. Her voice cracked but carried enough for all to hear. My son was gay, and he was a Marine. He came home to hate. Don't let this happen again. Her confession struck the room with a rawness that made even Caruso hesitate. Not long after, another voice rang out. A man in a dark suit stepped forward, flashing the seal of his bar card. He was a civil rights attorney, and his words cut like a gavel. Under the ADA, refusing a service dog is already unlawful. Add discrimination based on sexual orientation, and you are compounding violations that will not stand in any court. Ethan Hayes wheeled himself forward then, not waiting for permission. His voice shook, but he did not lower it. The spotlight was no longer something forced on him, it was something he claimed. I fought overseas. I lost my legs. I came out and lost my family. Tonight, I only wanted dinner. Instead, I was told that my sacrifice and my truth make me unworthy. The room cracked open, the sound of muffled sobs mixed with applause, hesitant at first, then swelling until the chandeliers trembled. Some clapped because the law demanded justice. Others clapped because Ethan's words reached the deepest corners of their own losses and fears. And a few clapped because a silence had been broken, and once broken, it could not be restored. One of the officers, who had watched the scene unfold with arms crossed, finally spoke. His tone carried the weight of authority, but softened with respect. "Sir," he said, looking squarely at Caruso, "refusing service based on disability or sexual orientation is illegal. You will seat him." The finality in those words stripped Caruso of his last defense. His jaw clenched, but the ground beneath him had shifted. The crowd no longer belonged to him. The law no longer shielded him. The room itself had turned, and in that turning, power changed hands. Ethan sat straighter in his chair, his breath slow but steady. For the first time in years, he had not been forced to carry the fight alone. And as the clapping faded into silence, the lesson lingered unspoken yet clear in justice. When confronted, exposes its own fragility. It feeds on fear and hesitation, but it crumbles when the truth is spoken aloud. That night proved that dignity can be defended not only by the one who suffers, but by anyone brave enough to stand beside them. The silence that followed the officer's words was heavier than any noise. Vincent Caruso's posture shrank, his once rigid stance dissolving under the weight of law, witnesses, and truth. His lips formed the outline of words he did not want to say, but could no longer escape. With the entire restaurant waiting, he muttered an apology. It was stiff, hollow, the kind of apology pulled by force rather than conscience. Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression unyielding. "Don't just apologize," he said, his tone cutting through the hush. "Change this place. Make it veteran-friendly. Make it LGBT-friendly. Train your staff. Change your culture." The demand did not echo like a threat, but like a blueprint for redemption. The crowd absorbed it, nodding in agreement, many realizing they had witnessed something larger than a confrontation. It was a call for accountability, not only for Caruso, but for every silent witness who had allowed prejudice to survive in polished spaces. That night ended with Ethan seated at a table, Rex curled loyally by his side. It was not the meal he had envisioned. The taste of food could never compete with the bitter sting of humiliation. Yet, as glasses lifted in quiet support around him, Ethan realized that survival was not the only victory. Visibility was. Months passed, and the aftershocks of that evening spread further than anyone expected. A guest video had captured the entire exchange, the insults, the silence, the stand of four SEALs, and Ethan's trembling yet defiant speech. The clip flooded across social media, gathering millions of views. What had begun as one man's humiliation became a story that resonated with strangers across the country. Bella Vista, under pressure from public outrage, transformed. The old signs that once boasted exclusivity were replaced with new ones carved in bold letters: veterans and LGBTQ+, always welcome. Staff underwent training led by advocates and legal experts, and at the heart of it stood Ethan Hayes. He became more than a face in a wheelchair, more than a man with scars. He became a teacher. He explained the role of service duties, the weight of invisible wounds, and the daily burden of discrimination. He told his story not as tragedy, but as truth, so no other veteran, no other gay man, would be shamed in the same way. The same restaurant that had once silenced him now paid him to make voices like his louder. It was not revenge. It was reclamation. The place that had tried to erase him now bore his mark. When Ethan looked back, he did not remember only the sting of Caruso's cruelty. He remembered the moment four men stood without hesitation, the moment strangers clapped through tears, the moment a law officer chose dignity over convenience. Those were the fragments that built pride out of shame, because pride is not given. It is forged when someone refuses to bend under humiliation and when others choose to stand alongside them. That night proved a truth that echoed louder than insults: no one should ever face prejudice alone. And so the lesson lingered, not written on a courtroom record, but in the hearts of those who witnessed. Change does not begin with everyone. It begins with someone. And sometimes someone is enough to shift an entire room. Now let me ask you, if you had been there that night, would you have stayed silent, or would you have stood up? For more stories where voices once silenced rise into strength, subscribe to Heart Stories and never miss the next chapter of courage.